They said the hardest part was over. But for millions of us, it wasn't the battles that haunted us. It was the waiting to get home. It was late 1945 when they told us about something called Operation Magic Carpet. The name sounded almost silly back then. Too light, too hopeful, like a fairy tale after too many years of smoke and thunder. But to those of us sitting in the damp barracks, staring out at endless gray water, it meant only one thing. We were finally going home. I still remember the smell of the port at Le Havre. Diesel fuel, salt, mud, and coffee so strong it could wake the dead. The docks were crowded with people, tens of thousands of us, each carrying a duffel bag and a memory we'd rather not talk about. Ships lined up like teeth along the horizon, their decks already full. Some men laughed, others stood silent, their eyes locked on nothing. They told us the operation would take months. 8 million souls, someone said. It'll take every ship we've got. They weren't exaggerating. Freighters were cleared of cargo to carry men instead of goods. Hospital ships, troop transports, even aircraft carriers were loaded to the brim. Anything that could float was called into service. The ship they put me on was called the General M.C. Meigs. I can still hear the creak of its hull, the rattle of boots on the gangway, the whistle of the officer yelling, "Keep moving, boys." But we didn't feel like soldiers anymore. We felt like travelers, tired, half-broken, but alive. There wasn't much space on board. Men slept wherever they could, stacked in bunks 6 high or stretched out in the corridors. The air below deck was thick, but nobody complained. We'd spent too many nights under worse conditions. Every time the engines roared, it felt like a heartbeat, a reminder that we were moving, inch by inch, toward the lives we'd left behind. We'd hear the waves slapping against the hull, steady as breathing. Sometimes when the sea was calm, we'd climb up to the deck just to feel the air on our faces. You could see men holding photos in their hands, wives, girlfriends, children they'd never met. They'd stare at those pictures as if they were maps showing the way back. Someone started singing one night, a slow tune, almost like a lullaby. Soon a few others joined in. Voices rose out of the darkness, unsteady but full of something I hadn't heard in years, hope. You could feel it ripple across the deck, soft and fragile like light breaking through fog. Days passed. The food was plain, the ocean endless. But the talk was constant, what we'd do first, what home would look like now. One guy said he'd buy a truck and drive until he ran out of road. Another said he'd never sleep indoors again, that roofs made him nervous now. We laughed, but deep down we all wondered the same thing. Could we really just step off this ship and pick up where we left off? Then came the morning the captain announced we'd be sighting land. "Gentlemen," he said over the loudspeaker, "America's waiting." Nobody moved for a moment. Then, slowly, men began to stand, pressing toward the railings, eyes straining to see the first line of coast. When it finally appeared, just a faint shadow in the distance, the ship erupted. Hats flew into the air. Men cheered, cried, hugged, shouted names of places they hadn't seen in years. It didn't matter that we were strangers. In that moment we were family. I found myself gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles turned white. For the first time in a long time the air smelled different, cleaner, familiar. Home wasn't just a place anymore. It was a promise kept. As the ship neared the harbor, a band started playing on the dock below. I'll never forget that sound, brass horns, drums, and laughter. And on the pier, Women waved handkerchiefs. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Cameras flashed. It looked like the whole country had shown up to welcome us back. When my boots finally touched the wooden planks, it felt unreal. The ground didn't sway. The world was still. Someone behind me whispered, "We made it." I turned, smiled, and said quietly, "Yeah, but now we've got to learn how to live again." Coming home wasn't like in the movies. There was no swelling music, no fade to black, no neat ending. The ship docked, the gangway dropped, and suddenly we were walking into a world that had kept turning without us. For most of us, it didn't feel real. The streets were cleaner. The cars looked newer. The people, they smiled too easily, moved too fast. Even the air smelled different, like gasoline and fresh paint instead of salt and sweat. I remember stepping off the pier with my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, not sure which way to go. There were crowds everywhere, wives holding flowers, children clutching cardboard signs, photographers snapping pictures. They cheered for anyone in uniform, but in their faces I saw something else too, a kind of searching. Everyone was looking for someone, afraid they might not find them. That night they gave us coffee and sandwiches at a small welcome center by the harbor. There was a radio playing softly in the corner, Frank Sinatra, I think, and a banner that said, "Welcome home, boys." I stood there for a long time, staring at those words, trying to believe they met me. I didn't have much to go back to. My parents had passed before I left, and my younger brother was somewhere out west, working the rail lines. So I took a train inland, not really caring where it stopped. Somewhere between Chicago and Kansas City, I realized the country had changed as much as we had. Factories that once made tanks now built washing machines. The billboards along the tracks spoke of a brighter tomorrow. Cars, radios, electric kitchens. Everyone wanted something new, something shiny. But all I wanted was to feel something familiar again. When I finally stepped off the train in a small town called Oak Ridge, I just stood there, watching life unfold. A group of kids raced by on bicycles, chasing each other through the street. A man in a hat was closing his shop for the night, humming as he locked the door. I hadn't heard a sound that ordinary in years. It nearly broke me. I rented a room above a diner, $10 a week, breakfast included. The woman who ran the place, Mrs. Callahan, had kind eyes and strong opinions. "You boys look too thin," she said when I walked in. "You'll eat double till you look human again." She didn't ask questions, and I didn't volunteer answers. But sometimes, late in the evening, when the customers were gone, she'd pour me a cup of coffee and talk about the town. How things had changed, how people still left their doors unlocked, how her oldest son had gone to work in a factory that made light bulbs. It was comforting, the rhythm of her voice, the scrape of cups on the counter, the steady hum of the refrigerator in the back. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't listening for sirens or distant thunder. Days turned into weeks. I took odd jobs where I could, fixing fences, hauling lumber, helping at the train depot. The work was simple, the pay enough to get by. But something inside me still felt suspended, like I was between two worlds, one that had ended and one that hadn't quite begun. Every now and then I'd go down to the post office. They had a bulletin board full of clippings about Operation Magic Carpet. I'd scan the lists of returning ships, even though mine had docked months earlier. It was strange, seeing the operation reduced to numbers and dates, when I knew it had been made of faces and stories. One afternoon I helped unload freight at the depot. A crate slipped and cracked open, spilling its contents across the floor. Hundreds of small photographs in black and white. I picked one up. It was a picture of a woman standing on a porch, smiling faintly at the camera. On the back, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Waiting." I don't know why, but that word stayed with me. Because that's what it felt like, all of us waiting for something. Waiting to feel whole again, to understand the distance between who we were and who we'd become. That evening, as the sun went down, I walked to the edge of town where the fields began. I could hear a radio playing through an open window somewhere, the crackle of laughter, a dog barking. Life ordinary, simple, real. I stood there in the fading light and realized something quietly profound. Maybe home wasn't a place you returned to. Maybe it was something you had to rebuild one piece at a time, in the small kindnesses, the steady work, the unspoken understanding between strangers. For the first time since stepping off that ship, I didn't feel lost, just unfinished. And maybe, for now, that was enough. By the summer of 1946, I'd been in Oak Ridge long enough for people to stop calling me that new fellow from the coast. I'd become something else, the man who fixed things. Radios, windows, leaky pipes. It didn't matter what it was. I liked that. There was a peace in taking something broken and making it right again. The diner became my anchor. Every morning I'd walk in to the smell of bacon and coffee, the bell above the door jingling, as if it were happy to see me. Mrs. Callahan always had a new story about the mayor's wife and her obsession with curtains, or how the high school band couldn't play in tune. The same faces filled the same stools day after day. To anyone else it might have looked dull. To me it was healing. I started renting the old garage behind the diner. It was dusty, but it had a workbench and a roof that didn't leak too badly. I set up a small repair shop, mostly for radios and fans. Word spread fast in a town that size. Folks would come by with broken things, linger for coffee, and leave a few dollars on the counter. I didn't have a sign, but somehow everyone knew where to find me. One afternoon, a woman came in carrying a radio the size of a suitcase. She was maybe in her 30s, hair pinned up neatly, eyes steady but kind. "They told me you can fix just about anything," she said. "I can try," I replied, smiling. She set it down gently. It belonged to my husband. It stopped working the week he left. I just never got around to fixing it. I didn't ask where he'd gone. Some questions were still too tender back then. I nodded, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. The tubes were dusty, the wiring old, but the machine was sound. I cleaned the contacts, replaced a few connections, and within an hour the thing hummed back to life. She just stood there, staring at it. The music that came through the speakers was faint, but warm, an old Glenn Miller tune that carried more emotion than words could. Her eyes glistened, but she smiled. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You brought back something I thought was gone." That night after she left, I sat alone in the shop listening to that same song on my own radio. There was something about the melody, sweet, a little sad, but steady. It made me think of how many people were just like her, trying to repair the invisible things that had stopped working inside them. The next morning I found a note slipped under the door. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I make a mean cup of coffee. Sarah." I kept that note folded in my wallet for years. Sarah began stopping by the shop from time to time, sometimes with her radio, sometimes just with conversation. She'd tell me about her garden, her students at the local school, or the stray cat that had decided to live on her porch. I'd listen, not saying much, but always feeling calmer after she left. One evening she asked, "Do you ever miss the old life?" I thought about that. "I miss the people," I said, "but not the noise." She nodded. "I think that's what everyone misses, someone, not something." By fall, the trees around Oak Ridge turned gold. Kids played in the leaves. The diner hung paper pumpkins in the window. Life was ordinary again, and that was its own kind of miracle. One Sunday I took a walk to the train station, the same platform where ID arrived months earlier. A new batch of men had just come home, their duffel bags lined up neatly beside them. They looked just like we had, a little lost, a little dazed, not quite ready for silence. The town gathered to greet them, just as they had for us. I watched as one man stepped off the train and dropped to his knees, hugging the ground. Another stood frozen, scanning the crowd until a small boy ran up to him, shouting, "Daddy." I don't think I'll ever forget that sound. Pure joy wrapped in disbelief. That night, back in my shop, I realized something I hadn't before. The journey home wasn't just about distance. It was about time, the time it takes for the heart to catch up to the body. So I kept fixing things. Radios, watches, old clocks that hadn't ticked in years. Maybe that was my way of helping others find their rhythm again. Each repair felt like a tiny act of hope, proof that things could be mended, no matter how long they'd been broken. Sometimes late at night I'd sit outside the garage, the street lights glowing dim and steady, and think about that ship, about the men still returning across the ocean. I wondered if they too were learning, in their own quiet ways, how to come back not just to their towns, but to themselves. By the spring of 1947, the town of Oak Ridge had settled into a rhythm, the kind you only notice when you lived somewhere long enough to know what silence sounds like. The factory whistle blew at 7, the church bells rang at noon, and every evening the street lights came on one by one, as if the town itself were tucking in for the night. I was still in my little shop behind the diner, fixing whatever people brought through the door. Radios, typewriters, sometimes even watches that had stopped decades earlier. I liked the ones that took time, the quiet work, the kind where you could lose yourself in small, careful movements. Sarah visited more often by then. Sometimes she'd bring a book or a jar of her homemade jam. Other times she'd just sit by the window while I worked, humming softly to whatever tune was playing on the radio. It wasn't complicated what we had, just two people finding comfort in the same quiet. One afternoon she arrived with something wrapped in cloth. "I found this in a box at the school," she said. "Thought you might know what to do with it." Inside was an old pocket watch. The glass was cracked, the hands frozen at 9:12. It was engraved on the back, "To J. Callahan, for service and steadiness." I smiled. "Mrs. Callahan's husband," I said. Sarah nodded. "She said it hasn't worked since he passed. Maybe you could fix it?" I took the watch apart slowly, each piece laid out in perfect order on a square of linen. The mechanism was worn, but not lost. A spring had snapped, nothing I couldn't mend. For hours I worked while Sarah read aloud from a book of poems she'd brought, her voice soft and steady. When I finished, I wound the watch and listened. Tick, tick, tick. The sound filled the room like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. We brought it to Mrs. Callahan that evening. She held it to her ear, tears catching the light. "He used to check this every morning," she whispered. "Said a man should keep good time, even when the world doesn't." She smiled, handed me a slice of pie, and said, "You've got good hands, son. You fix more than what you touch." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. But later that night, sitting by the open window, I thought about her words. Maybe that is what all of us were doing, fixing things that couldn't really be fixed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to keep them going. Enough to keep ourselves going. Months passed, and life found its balance again. The trains came and went, the fields bloomed, and laughter began to sound normal instead of strange. The world was rebuilding itself, not in grand gestures but in small ones, in repaired watches, in radios that played again, in hands that kept reaching for connection. Sarah and I started taking walks on Sundays down to the river where the old bridge crossed. She'd talk about her students, about the future she hoped for them, a world quieter, kinder, less divided. I'd listen, letting her words fill the space I used to fill with worry. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she stopped and looked out over the water. "Do you ever think," she said, "that maybe what you're redoing here, all this fixing, it as part of something bigger?" I shrugged. "I just like seeing things work again." She smiled. "Maybe, but I think you're reminding people that things can work again." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint sound of church bells in the distance. It felt like the kind of moment you don't realize is important until much later. Years passed, but Oak Ridge never really changed. And that was its gift. The world could spin faster somewhere else, but here time moved at a pace that let you notice it. I kept the shop, kept fixing things, kept living quietly. And sometimes on warm evenings I'd sit outside, listening to the ticking of a dozen clocks in the window. Their rhythms never quite matched, a soft, imperfect symphony. But together they sounded like life itself, flawed, steady, beautiful. Looking back now, I think that's what Operation Magic Carpet really was. Not just ships bringing men home, but hearts learning how to return. We didn't all come back the same, but somehow we found our way. And if you ask me what home means after all those years, I'd say this: it's not a place, and it's not a moment. It's the quiet understanding that no matter what breaks, there's always someone or something willing to fix it. If this story reminded you of someone, a parent, a friend, or a moment you thought you'd forgotten, take a second before you go. Like the people who fixed what was broken, we keep these memories alive by sharing them. Leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe, not for numbers, but so stories like this one are never lost to time. Because remembering them means remembering who we are,